The morning started differently in the billionaire's mansion, something he couldn't quite explain. He usually woke up to the soft hum of the city far below, the warm sunlight spilling gently through his enormous floor-to-ceiling windows, and the quiet footsteps of his staff moving about, attending to their morning chores. But today, everything was unusually still, almost too quiet. The familiar sounds of clinking dishes and distant chatter were missing, replaced by an eerie silence that made him frown. As he opened his eyes, he noticed the golden light falling strangely across the room, highlighting the opulence of his bedroom. High ceilings, thick curtains, polished marble floors, and furniture so luxurious it could have been in a museum. Everything was perfect, yet he felt an uncomfortable heaviness in the air, as if the house itself was holding its breath. He swung his legs over the side of the massive bed and rubbed his eyes, trying to shake off the strange feeling. Normally, mornings in this house followed a strict rhythm, breakfast prepared by his chef, the newspapers laid out neatly, and his staff bustling around with seamless efficiency. But this morning, none of that happened. Instead, the rooms echoed with silence, broken only by the soft whir of the air conditioning. He got up and walked to the window, looking down at the sprawling gardens, noticing that even the gardeners hadn't yet appeared. The fountain in the center of the courtyard glistened under the sunlight, its water sparkling as usual, yet the emptiness around it made the place feel oddly cold and unfamiliar. Curiosity and unease mingled in his mind, pushing him to get out of his room and investigate. He moved through the long hallway, his expensive leather slippers making faint squeaks on the polished marble. The walls, adorned with priceless paintings, seemed to stare at him silently, as if aware of the unusual tension in the house. Every step he took was measured, cautious, yet purposeful. He passed the drawing room and dining hall, noticing that not a single chair had been moved, not a single item misplaced. The order was intact, yet it felt lifeless, almost eerie, like a museum frozen in time. He finally reached the corridor leading to the servant quarters, and the unease grew stronger. He had lived in this mansion for years, and he knew every sound, every movement, every rhythm of his staff. But now, there was nothing. The usual bustle of early morning activity, the sounds of utensils, soft murmurs, and footsteps, was gone, leaving behind only a heavy silence. As he neared the quarters, he noticed something that made his heart skip a beat. A faint, almost imperceptible sound, like a soft whimper, came from one of the rooms. He paused, straining his ears, wondering if he had imagined it, but then it came again, slightly louder, a sound of distress, hesitation, fear. Something was wrong, something he hadn't expected in the orderly, well-managed life of his mansion. He quickened his steps, a sense of urgency replacing his usual calm composure. His mind raced with questions. Who could be in trouble? What had happened? He opened the door to one of the rooms slowly, careful not to startle anyone, and there she was, his maid, sitting quietly in the corner, her head slightly bowed, her arms wrapped around herself, trying to hide something. The faint marks on her skin were visible even from a distance, pale and red against her otherwise smooth skin. It was a sight that made his chest tighten, a mixture of surprise, worry, and an unfamiliar feeling he couldn't name. He felt a pang of guilt for not noticing anything sooner, for assuming that everything in his house ran smoothly without checking on the people who worked so hard every day. The reality of what he saw made him pause and reflect on how little he truly knew about the lives of those around him. His mansion, full of wealth and luxury, had always felt like a fortress, a place of control, but now it felt fragile, vulnerable, exposed. Standing there quietly, he realized that this morning was not going to be like any other. This was not a day for business deals or meetings, not a day for luxury and comfort. This morning was different. It carried with it a story, a mystery, a problem that demanded his attention. He could feel the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders, not as a billionaire, but as a human being. Someone had suffered, and he was now the first person to witness it. The silence that had once felt strange now demanded action, and he knew he couldn't ignore it. For the first time in a long while, the billionaire felt a shift within himself. The routines and habits that had defined his life seemed small and insignificant compared to the real emotions and struggles of the people around him. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, realizing that this morning, something had changed, something important, and that his day, and perhaps his life, would never be the same again. He stepped closer, his eyes fixed on the maid as a sinking feeling settled in his chest. He had never seen her like this before. Her usual cheerful demeanor, her polite smile, and the quiet efficiency with which she moved around the mansion were gone, replaced by a stillness that made him uneasy. Her hands trembled slightly as she pulled her sleeves down, trying to hide the marks that ran along her arms, but the effort was futile. For anyone with a keen eye, the faint bruises and red streaks were impossible to miss. The billionaire's mind raced, questions colliding in his head. How had this happened? Who could have done this? And why had no one told him? He had always prided himself on knowing every corner of his home, every person who worked for him, and yet here was a truth he hadn't expected, staring him in the face. His heart pounded, not with anger toward her, but with concern, a feeling that was strange yet undeniable. He knelt slightly to meet her eyes, hoping to read the story they held. At first, she looked away, her gaze fixed on the floor as though daring him to look closer, but he could see it there, the silent plea, the fear, and the shame interwoven in the lines of her face. It was impossible to ignore, and the silence between them grew heavier, almost suffocating. Finally, in a small, hesitant voice, she spoke. Her words were careful, deliberate, as though weighing every syllable to ensure nothing dangerous would follow. She mentioned an incident, something outside the mansion, something no one had expected, something that had left its mark not just on her body, but on her spirit as well. The billionaire listened quietly, the initial shock on his face giving way to a mix of disbelief and deep empathy. He could feel the walls of his world shifting slightly. The mansion, with all its luxury and elegance, suddenly seemed less important than the fragile human being in front of him. Here was someone who had devoted her life to keeping his world perfect, yet her own world had been shattered, unseen, and unheard until this very moment. The realization hit him hard. He had been blind to the struggles of those closest to him, wrapped up in routines, wealth, and appearances. Something inside him changed then, a spark of determination ignited. This was no longer a quiet observation, no longer a distant curiosity. This was real, immediate, and it demanded action. He couldn't let this go unnoticed or unaddressed, not in his home, not on his watch. He reached out carefully, placing a hand on her shoulder, a simple gesture, but one filled with reassurance and concern. "You're safe here," he said softly, his voice carrying a calm authority, yet an unmistakable warmth. The words seemed to surprise her, as if she had never imagined a billionaire showing such care without judgment. The tension in her body eased slightly, and for a moment, she allowed herself to breathe, to hope. The silence that followed was different from the silence of the morning. It was no longer empty or eerie, but charged with understanding and an unspoken promise. He would not turn away, he would not ignore what he saw. The marks on her arms told a story that could not be erased, but perhaps, with his help, the pain could be lessened. In that moment, the billionaire realized how fragile life could be, how easily appearances could deceive, and how vital it was to look beyond the surface. He had always been surrounded by luxury, servants, and staff who followed routines, but this discovery reminded him that life's most important truths were often hidden, waiting for someone to notice. He straightened, resolved to take action, his mind already planning the steps he would take to ensure her safety and well-being. The mansion, once a symbol of control and perfection, now felt like a stage for compassion and responsibility. It was a morning that had begun like any other, but it had already changed everything, revealing a side of life, and of himself, that he had rarely faced. And as he stood there, looking at her, he knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The unexpected discovery had pulled back a curtain on reality, leaving him with a responsibility he could not ignore, and a determination that would define the day, and perhaps, the rest of his life. The billionaire's heart raced, but he forced himself to stay calm, knowing that any sudden movement or harsh words could frighten her further. He could see the fear in her eyes, a mixture of shame and worry, and it tugged at something deep inside him, something he rarely allowed himself to feel in public. He had always been the man in control, sharp, decisive, untouchable, but this moment demanded a different kind of strength. The strength to care, to listen, and to act with kindness. He stepped closer, his voice gentle, almost a whisper, yet firm enough to command attention. "Tell me exactly what happened," he said. His words were not a question of authority, but of concern, and she hesitated, her lips trembling, her hands twisting the fabric of her uniform nervously. He could feel the weight of her hesitation, the fear that her story might bring trouble, yet he waited patiently, silently urging her to speak. Finally, her voice broke the silence, soft at first, barely audible, then stronger as the need to be heard overcame her fear. She spoke of a neighbor who had been cruel, of threats and harsh words, of being caught in situations she could not control, of nights spent worrying whether someone would help her or turn a blind eye. As she spoke, the marks on her arms seemed to tell the same story, each one a silent witness to the fear and pain she had endured. The billionaire listened closely, his mind racing with disbelief and anger, but he kept his emotions in check, knowing that what she needed most was not outrage, but support. He motioned for her to sit down, and she complied reluctantly, still wary. Her trust had been shaken, and he understood that no amount of polite reassurance would erase the fear she carried. Instead, he offered his presence, sitting a few steps away, silent but attentive, letting her know that she was no longer alone. As she continued, he noticed small details, the way she flinched at sudden movements, the way her hands shook when she gestured, the hesitation before every word. All of it spoke of trauma, of a life where she had to hide her pain to survive. It was a reality he had never considered in his own world of wealth and luxury, a reminder that privilege did not shield one from human suffering, and that those around him were living battles he had never seen. A surge of protectiveness rose within him, sharp and unyielding. He could no longer remain a passive observer. He needed to act, to ensure that she was safe, to make certain that no one could hurt her again. Yet he also understood that action required delicacy, that care without sensitivity could worsen the situation. He had to balance authority with empathy, control with compassion. He stood slowly, moving toward her with deliberate calm, his presence reassuring rather than intimidating. "You don't have to face this alone," he said quietly. The words seemed to surprise her, as if she had never imagined a billionaire speaking to her not as an employer, but as someone who genuinely cared. She looked up at him, her eyes searching, unsure if she could believe the sincerity in his voice. In that moment, he made a decision, one that would change the course of the day and perhaps the course of both their lives. He would not ignore what he had seen, nor would he allow it to be brushed aside. She would be protected, cared for, and supported, without judgment. He would use his power not to punish, but to shield, to ensure that the marks on her arms would no longer be a symbol of fear, but a reminder that someone had noticed, someone had acted. As he left the room briefly to make arrangements, he felt a strange mix of emotions, anger at the injustice she had faced, guilt for not seeing it sooner, and a growing determination to do what was right. He knew that the world outside his mansion could be harsh and unkind, but inside these walls, he had the ability to change things, to create a small corner of safety, comfort, and hope. When he returned, he found her quieter now, still hesitant but calmer. A small shift had occurred, a subtle sign that trust could be built, that even in a world of luxury and distance, compassion could bridge the gap. The billionaire realized that his day, which had begun like any other, was no longer about business deals, investments, or appearances. It was about people, about responsibility, and about doing what was right when no one else might. And in that quiet moment, both of them understood something profound. Sometimes, true strength is not in wealth or power, but in care, presence, and action. The billionaire had discovered a side of himself he rarely acknowledged, and the maid had found a glimmer of hope she had long thought lost. Together, their lives were about to change in ways neither could have anticipated. The maid's hands trembled as she folded them tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed on the floor as if it held all the answers. The billionaire sat patiently, giving her space yet remaining close enough to show he was there. She took a deep breath, trying to gather the courage to speak. Each word felt heavy, like carrying a secret she had been forced to bear alone for far too long. Finally, her voice broke the silence, soft but clear. "It started a few weeks ago," she said. I didn't know who to tell. I thought if I kept quiet, it would go away, but it didn't." Her words came out in small, careful pieces, like fragile glass she feared would shatter if spoken too quickly. She told him about the neighbor who had always seemed polite on the surface, but behind closed doors was cruel, demanding, and aggressive, someone who took advantage of her kindness, someone who saw her as powerless. She described nights filled with fear, moments where she had nowhere to go, nowhere to hide, and nowhere to turn. Every detail painted a picture of quiet suffering, of endurance that few could imagine. The billionaire listened without interrupting, his usual sharp mind absorbing every nuance. He could feel the tension in the room, the weight of unspoken emotions pressing down on both of them. He noticed the way her shoulders slumped, the way her voice wavered with every memory, and the tiny pauses she took to catch herself from breaking down completely. Each mark on her skin suddenly made sense, a visible reminder of invisible struggles. She went on to explain how she had tried to stay strong for everyone else, how she had hidden her pain from friends, family, and even the staff in the mansion. She felt trapped, powerless in a world that seemed indifferent to her suffering. The billionaire's chest tightened as he realized that wealth, privilege, and comfort had done nothing to shield her from the cruelty of life. It was a stark reminder that no amount of luxury could protect someone from being hurt, and no amount of authority could make up for a lack of awareness. As she spoke, he noticed small gestures that told more than words ever could, the way she rubbed her arms subconsciously, as if trying to soothe invisible pain, the way her eyes darted toward the door occasionally, as if expecting someone to appear and disrupt her confession. Every movement reflected a life lived in caution and fear, a life in which trust had been earned only in tiny fragments. When she paused, exhausted from the flood of memories, he reached out gently, resting a hand lightly on hers, not touching the bruises, but offering a silent promise of protection. "You're safe now," he said softly, "no one will hurt you here. I'll make sure of it." His voice carried a calm authority, but it was his sincerity that made her flinch with surprise. She had never expected a man of such power and wealth to care so deeply about her. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, she allowed herself to breathe, a small flicker of relief shining through the fear that had dominated her life. The billionaire realized then that the most important thing he could do wasn't to punish anyone immediately, but to ensure that she felt safe, valued, and heard. He wanted her to know that her story mattered, that her pain mattered, and that he would not turn away. As he listened, he also reflected on his own life, on the routines and luxuries he had always taken for granted, the mansion, the servants, the endless wealth. They had created a bubble, a world where he rarely saw the struggles of others. He had always believed that control over his life meant control over everything around him, but now he understood that true responsibility was far more complex. It involved empathy, action, and the courage to face uncomfortable truths. By the time she finished, the room had shifted. The fear was still there, but it was tempered with a new sense of hope. The billionaire had witnessed her story, acknowledged her pain, and promised her safety, and in doing so, a bond of trust had been quietly formed. Something delicate, fragile, but real, had begun. And in that moment, he knew that this was only the beginning, that hearing her story was the first step, but acting on it, truly protecting her, guiding her, and standing by her, would define not just the rest of the day, but perhaps the rest of both their lives. The billionaire sat in silence for a few moments after hearing her story, the weight of her words pressing heavily on his mind. He could feel the anger simmering beneath his calm exterior, an anger not toward her, but toward a world that allowed such cruelty to exist. He had always believed he could control everything within the walls of his mansion, but outside, in the shadows of the city, people suffered unseen. And for the first time, he realized that wealth and influence alone were not enough. They had to be paired with action. He stood slowly, pacing the room as he thought, his sharp mind, used to negotiating business deals and analyzing investments, now turned to a different kind of problem: how to ensure her safety and restore a sense of trust in a world that had betrayed her. The decision he made in that moment was clear, though it would require more than authority or money. It would require courage, decisiveness, and empathy. He approached her again, kneeling slightly to meet her eyes. "You will not face this alone anymore," he said, his voice steady, but filled with sincerity. She looked at him, unsure whether to believe him, her eyes wide with a mixture of hope and fear. "I promise," he continued, "I will make sure you are protected. Whatever it takes, you will be safe, and no one will harm you again." The words seemed to land gently in her heart, offering a flicker of comfort she had long forgotten. She swallowed hard, blinking back tears, and for the first time, allowed herself to trust him fully, realizing that he meant every word. The billionaire knew, however, that promises alone were not enough. Action was required. He walked to his private study and made a series of phone calls, each one precise, each one deliberate. He contacted trusted friends, security personnel, and advisors who he knew would act quickly, decisively, and with discretion. By the time he returned to the room, a plan had been set in motion, a plan to ensure her safety, to confront the source of her suffering, and to create a protective environment where she could begin to heal. He explained to her the steps he had taken, assuring her that she would not have to face the aftermath alone, that she would be supported, guided, and protected at every stage. As he spoke, she felt a strange mixture of relief and awe, never imagining that someone of his status could care so deeply about her well-being. She realized that this moment marked a turning point, not just for her, but for both of them. The billionaire reflected quietly on what had led him to this point. He had always believed that strength came from control, that power was about dominance and influence, but now he understood that true strength was also measured by compassion, by the willingness to act when someone is vulnerable, and by the courage to challenge injustice wherever it is found. He made one final decision that would shape the days to come. He would not let this incident fade into a forgotten event. He would use his resources, influence, and authority to create a safe space, not only for her but for anyone else in similar situations. His decision was not about punishment or revenge, it was about protection, care, and justice, a choice that reflected a deeper understanding of responsibility and humanity. Sitting back, he looked at her, noticing how she seemed smaller, yet stronger in that moment, strengthened by the knowledge that someone powerful and caring had chosen to stand by her side. He could see hope flickering in her eyes, and it filled him with an unexpected warmth, a reminder that even in a world filled with cruelty, one person's decision could change everything. And as he watched her quietly, he realized that this decision, simple as it may seem, was not just about safeguarding her, it was about redefining who he was, about learning to balance power with empathy, authority with compassion, and wealth with responsibility. That morning had begun like any other, but now, after hearing her story and making this choice, the billionaire knew that life inside the mansion, and beyond, would never be the same again. News of what had happened spread through the mansion quietly at first, carried by whispers and curious glances. The staff who had once treated the billionaire as a distant, unapproachable figure now watched him in a new light. Their morning routines continued, but there was an unspoken awareness in the air, a shift in the atmosphere that could not be ignored. The mansion, usually a place of rigid hierarchy and silent efficiency, now felt alive with subtle tension and quiet admiration. Those who had served him for years noticed the change in his demeanor, the way his voice softened when speaking to the maid, the way he moved with patience rather than authority, and the way his eyes reflected concern and genuine care. It was a side of him few had ever seen, a vulnerability mixed with strength that commanded respect in a different way. Among the staff, reactions varied. Some were shocked, unable to reconcile the billionaire they had always known with the man who now displayed such empathy. Others felt a deep sense of relief and hope, realizing that someone in power truly cared about justice and the well-being of those under his roof. Even the head chef, a man who had witnessed countless deals and disputes, paused mid-chop and shook his head in quiet disbelief, whispering to a colleague, "I never thought I'd see him like this." The maid herself noticed the subtle changes too, not just in him, but in how others responded. Some approached her quietly, offering small smiles or gentle words of encouragement. Their gestures, though simple, carried a weight of reassurance. They saw that the billionaire's actions were more than just a fleeting moment of concern. They were a declaration that her safety and dignity mattered, and that acknowledgement alone could change lives. Outside the mansion, news traveled differently. Through connections, trusted friends, and a few select confidants, the story of the billionaire who had acted decisively and compassionately spread, accompanied by murmurs of disbelief. Some laughed in skepticism, thinking it unusual for someone of such wealth and status to show genuine care, but others were inspired, seeing in his actions a reminder that power need not be cold or distant, that it could be wielded with heart and humanity. Even within his circle of influential associates, the reactions were surprising. Some colleagues congratulated him quietly, sensing that he had made a morally correct decision, while others stared in mild shock, unable to comprehend how someone so driven by business and precision could suddenly prioritize human compassion above everything else. The billionaire, however, remained calm, unaffected by gossip or judgment, focused only on the reality before him, the maid's safety, her trust, and the quiet restoration of dignity that he had promised. The unexpected reactions revealed something deeper about people. He realized that actions, even small ones, could ripple outward, affecting everyone who witnessed them, changing perceptions, challenging assumptions, and inspiring others to act with empathy. The mansion, once a symbol of power and control, now felt like a living testament to the impact of compassion, a place where one person's choice could influence not just a life, but the entire environment around them. And in the midst of it all, the billionaire understood that true leadership was not measured by deals or wealth, but by the courage to do what is right, even when it surprises or confuses others. He saw that vulnerability, honesty, and care could inspire loyalty and respect far more than fear or authority could. The unexpected reactions of those around him, both staff and peers, reinforced a simple truth: empathy, when acted upon, carries power beyond any material wealth. That evening, as the sun cast long shadows across the mansion's grand halls, he walked past the staff, offering quiet nods and soft smiles. Noticing how the atmosphere had shifted subtly yet profoundly, he glanced at the maid, who now seemed calmer, her posture slightly more relaxed, and he knew that the reactions he had witnessed were not merely about surprise, they were about acknowledgement, a recognition that the world could change if someone had the courage to act. And in that quiet moment, the billionaire felt a sense of fulfillment unlike any he had ever known. For the first time, he realized that true influence was not about control over people, but about inspiring change through compassion, and that the reactions of those around him, unexpected as they were, had already begun to shape a new reality within the walls of his home, and perhaps, far beyond. The billionaire sat alone in his private study that evening, the events of the morning replaying vividly in his mind. The mansion was quiet now, the usual hum of activity replaced by a peaceful stillness, yet his thoughts were anything but calm. He reflected on what had happened, on the marks he had seen, and the story the maid had shared. Each detail weighed heavily on him, forcing him to confront truths he had long avoided. He thought about the routines of his life, the strict schedules, the endless meetings, the constant pursuit of wealth and power. For years, he had believed that success was measured by control, influence, and material accumulation, but the events of this morning had shattered that notion, revealing a reality far more important: the lives and struggles of people around him, unseen and often ignored. He realized that true responsibility went beyond signing contracts or managing businesses. It meant noticing pain, understanding vulnerability, and acting decisively to protect others. He had always thought of himself as a man in control, yet he had been blind to the suffering that existed in plain sight, within his own household, within the walls he thought were secure. The billionaire also recognized a personal truth: power without empathy was hollow, empty, and incomplete. Wealth and influence could move mountains, but they could not heal hearts or restore trust unless paired with care, understanding, and compassion. In the act of helping the maid, he had discovered something he had never expected: a sense of fulfillment and clarity that no business deal or investment could provide. He remembered the reactions of his staff, the subtle nods, the quiet admiration, and even the skeptical glances. Those reactions had taught him another lesson: that leadership was not about fear or authority, but about inspiring respect and trust, that genuine concern and decisive action could ripple outward, changing not just the life of one person, but the culture of an entire household. He thought about the maid, her courage in telling the truth despite fear, her resilience in facing hardships, and the trust she had placed in him. It dawned on him that learning from others was as important as any lesson taught through experience or success, that humility, patience, and listening were powerful tools, capable of transforming relationships and lives. The billionaire reflected on his own behavior before this morning, realizing how easy it had been to overlook the struggles of those around him, to assume that appearances reflected reality, and to believe that wealth and privilege insulated him from the hardships of life. Now he understood that true awareness required attention, empathy, and willingness to act. Even a man with immense power could be blind if he failed to notice the human stories unfolding nearby. He made a silent promise to himself: he would never again ignore those in need, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant their struggles might seem, that he would use his influence and resources not just to protect his own world, but to protect the vulnerable, to intervene when injustice was clear, and to create spaces of safety, dignity, and respect. As he sat back, a sense of quiet resolve settled over him. He realized that life's lessons often came unexpectedly, through moments of discomfort and surprise. The morning that had begun as ordinary had become extraordinary, teaching him about compassion, courage, and the true meaning of responsibility. And as the sun set behind the sprawling mansion, casting long shadows across the marble floors, he understood something profound, that real power was not measured by wealth or authority, but by the courage to act when action mattered most, by noticing pain, offering support, and standing up for those who could not stand for themselves. He had learned a lesson that would guide him far beyond the walls of his home, shaping not only the rest of that day but the rest of his life. The day had already been filled with emotions the billionaire had never anticipated, yet as evening descended over the mansion, a new, unexpected moment waited to unfold. He had spent hours reflecting, planning, and ensuring the maid's safety, believing that he had done all that was needed to restore order and calm, yet life, as it often did, had one final twist in store, one that would leave everyone in shock. As he returned to the main hall, he noticed a figure standing near the grand staircase, someone he had not expected to see, an unfamiliar man, dressed neatly but with a nervous energy that made the billionaire instinctively tense. The maid, who had been quietly standing nearby, froze, her eyes widening in alarm, and the air in the room grew thick with anticipation. The man took a hesitant step forward, holding out an envelope, his hands trembled slightly, and he spoke with a voice that betrayed both fear and urgency. "Sir, I need to explain. This concerns her, and the Marks." The billionaire's mind raced, trying to understand what new revelation could possibly follow. He gestured for him to continue, his eyes narrowing slightly, curiosity mingled with caution. The maid's expression was unreadable, a mix of fear and anticipation. As the man spoke, he revealed that the marks on her arms were not entirely what they seemed. There had been a misunderstanding involving someone she had trusted outside the mansion, a situation that had spiraled into unintended consequences, leaving her vulnerable to harm, but not from the people she feared. The billionaire listened carefully, his heart pounding. His first instinct was always action, but this required patience, observation, and discernment. The revelation challenged everything that had happened that morning, yet it did not diminish the importance of his earlier decisions. Instead, it highlighted the complexity of human life, where fear, trust, and misunderstanding could collide in unpredictable ways. As the story unfolded, he realized that the maid's courage in facing him, and his own actions to protect her, had created a ripple effect that changed outcomes beyond anyone's control. The man apologized, explaining the chain of events that had led to the marks, the confusion, and the fear, yet in his words, it became clear that this morning had been a turning point, a catalyst that revealed hidden truths and inspired real protection and care. The billionaire turned to the maid, seeing a new strength in her eyes. She had faced fear, told her story, and now, through confusion and misunderstanding, she had survived with dignity intact. He felt a wave of pride, not just in his actions, but in her resilience, realizing that courage was not always loud or visible. It could be quiet, persistent, and transformative. In that moment, he understood something profound. Life was unpredictable, full of twists that could shock, confuse, and challenge even the strongest minds, but it was also full of lessons, compassion, and the chance to make a difference. Even when outcomes were uncertain, choosing empathy and action created a ripple that could change lives, heal wounds, and restore hope. The mansion, which had felt tense, eerie, and fragile that morning, now seemed alive in a new way. Its walls echoed with stories of courage, care, and unexpected twists, and as the billionaire watched the maid take a hesitant, but steady step forward, he knew that the events of the day had altered not only her life, but his own, leaving him more aware, more compassionate, and more committed to noticing the unseen struggles around him. Finally, the billionaire sat back in his study, exhausted yet fulfilled, knowing that the shock of the day was not a tragedy, but a revelation. The unexpected morning, the discovery, the decisions, and now the final twist had all woven together to form a lesson about life, power, and humanity. He realized that wealth and influence were meaningless without heart, and that even in the most shocking circumstances, action, empathy, and courage could create hope where fear once ruled. And as night fell over the mansion, the lights flickering softly in the grand halls, he understood that the story was far from over. It was just beginning. A new chapter of awareness, responsibility, and unexpected connections had started, leaving everyone involved changed forever.